Okay, let's get started. I don't really need to introduce the speakers. You already know who they are. I'm the moderator. The moderator really doesn't have a role at all. However, I am going to at least say a couple of preliminary remarks. As old as I am and been involved in this field since '85, I've probably been to 250 plus conferences and training sessions. And I got to tell you that I think this is the best one I've ever been to. It's been the most interesting one I've ever been to. It's probably one of the most important ones I've ever been to. So I need to really congratulate Bob and the other organizers for getting this thing going. Secondly, all the sessions we've had are extremely important, including this one right here, okay? And I'm reminded of a statement by a good friend of mine who's the NASA vet, Joe Belitsky. And he says, you gotta like your investigators enough to keep them from getting killed, okay? And that's what occupational health and safety is all about. It's making sure that the people who go out in the field come back in whole pieces. So, our faculty, Patricia Klein and Chris Parkinson, take over, and I guess I can give you back your microphone now. All right.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I guess I'll lead this off, and thanks. I guess we're going to try not to kill people along the way. Thanks, that's a good goal. So thank you everybody for paying attention to this, as I would agree, and I've given a lecture like this in other situations, including to like biosafety officers. I mean, that was the take-home message, is that the biosafety principles that you practice in your laboratory are the ones that we need to carry into the field as well. It's a different environment, and Chris and I are going to try to tag team this, so this will be fun this afternoon. This will keep you guys awake. You never know who's going to be speaking next. So what we'd like to outline today is, let's first of all define the field, and that has been my presentation in other situations is, again, to a lot of laboratorians. You know, I actually grew up, I call it, I grew up as a med tech before I went to vet school, and I actually worked in a very prestigious New York medical research facility for a number of years before I was fortunate enough actually to apply and get into vet school. So I came out of the late 1970s, 1980s in lab animal research, and sort of knew the good, the bad, and the ugly of those days. And from there, you know, when I went through vet school, I came out and wanted to be working in the field of wildlife, and I was fortunate enough, first off, to work for Fish and Wildlife Service at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. And so I'm bringing that up because I then worked with captive wildlife that were being used in research. But I'd had that previous background. So fortunately, I was kind of grounded in laboratory animal practices, including occupational safety and health, and tried my best to apply those in a captive wildlife situation. And now, fortunately, now that I'm in the Forest Service, I'm now working with free-ranging fish and wildlife. So I keep trying to move, you know, my principles and my experiences forward and apply them in different situations. So I encourage you also to keep those things in mind. So let's define the field. Let's also look at the issue of lab safety versus field safety. As I just mentioned, how we take very similar principles or the principles and apply them in different situations. And we will also kind of tie together, particularly this partnership between the IACUC and the occupational safety and health folks. It is a strong partnership, and it has that issue both of animal well-being as well as people well-being. And we'll mention some of the One Health connections and the disease triad, or as those of you know, the EPI triangle. And the bottom line out of all of this is going to be situational awareness, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means and give you some resources as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
So I couldn't figure out why I got assigned to do occupational health and safety. Okay, I work with really nice critters. They won't kill you. And I work in really nice places, and you can't fall off the cliff and die. So Bob asked me to do occupational health and safety. And so can we take what we do in lab, which I do as well, I have a whole genomics lab, and apply what we do in there in our field, the biomedical aspect in the field? So the first thing I have to ask is, where is the field? Where truly is the field? I would argue it's the natural environment. okay? Being outside, not sitting in traffic, not sitting in your lab like Juan or Chris is here, but being out in the field. So all of these pictures right here are true field pictures where we've been working. The best one to me is right here where I'm in Brazil on my satellite phone checking in with the director of EHS. Then I had that picture and I emailed it to him, just giving him some grief. But the point is you're in the field. And so what are the risks associated with being in the field? So here's another one down here in this corner. You can't really tell what it is, but that's a picture of the University of Central Florida campus. What is right next to it is a 1.5 meter eastern diamondback rattlesnake. And on campus, I have about 20 of these individuals pit tagged. So I walk outside of my building and I can work with eastern diamondback rattlesnakes. So the question is, where's the field and how do you mitigate that? I just moved to Clemson, as you all know. Last year, I was told there was a copperhead bite on campus. Natural, legitimate, a student stepped on the animal. Okay? So we have to think about how you mitigate, especially with people that work in the field, truly are out working in the field. Now, we've talked about a lot of this already. So the Animal Welfare Act of '05 amendment, it includes field studies conducted on free living wild animals, field studies that are not invasive, do not harm, or do not materially alter the behavior of that animal under study are exempt. Okay? Now, here's the kicker that all of us have been asking. How do we know where that line is drawn? What I think Bob said a second ago was really good in that it's exempt from the Animal Welfare Act of reporting those, but at most institutions, most academic institutions where my experience is, you still are required to do an animal use protocol. Okay? So different ones deal with it different ways in terms of that. We all have different reporting, federal policies, permits, things like that that we have to do. Now, getting back to that question, who does an animal use protocol? At the University of Central Florida, where I was, our IACUC agreed on putting a policy in place for our researchers. And basically, it was a very simple policy. If you don't touch the animal, you don't need an IACUC. But we also had a field safety guideline. If you were going in the field, you had to put in a field safety protocol. And so that helped EHS deal with any field safety risk to mitigate that risk. The Forest Service does a waiver. Everybody has to put in some sort of document. The IACUC there looks at it and potentially will give you a waiver that you don't have to do a full-blown IACUC. So different institutions deal with it differently. Okay. Now, in reality, we have multiple components of occupational health and safety. When this initially came down in '08, dealing with occupational health and safety, all my investigators were, why are you asking me about driving an ATV or using a dart gun? You're the IACUC. EHS over here is the one, and they don't talk to me, so it's okay. All right? And it's really true. You have the field workers we have to worry about. We all have had students out in the field that have had accidents. I don't know if anybody knows, we at the University of Central Florida had a death of a graduate student dealing with field research. Okay? And so it can happen. Field safety is very important. The environment, dealing with the habitat, the wild animals. But now you're starting to see a lot of wildlife disease come up. And so the biosafety component, we have to be considerate and think about that. Do I think about moving from point A to point B and maybe moving chytrid back and forth? Historically, I did not. I've traveled in 18 countries working on reptiles and amphibians. Last year, it really got brought home to me when another investigator started showing me data about transference. Right. We have to think about that. Working with venomous snakes, I have had hours worth of job safety analyses done on everything I do. When we take an animal out, when we move an animal, all of those. My initial gut reaction when we were going through ALAC accreditation was, I don't want to deal with this. After I spent a lot of time listening, I learned how much it could save us, how much it can protect my students, protect me when it comes down to risk and mitigating that risk. The job safety analyses, how many of you, your EHS actually comes in and does that on all of your animal care and use aspect? Wow.
Oops.
Okay, so not that many. It's something, here's where that partnership really truly comes in. You need to become a partner with your EHS. Bring your EHS folks to these meetings. It's taken a long time. It took me a long time at the University of Central Florida to get EHS involved and to train them not to be the police, but to be the investigator's partner. So when we were doing our lab safety inspections, they were trying to write faculty up for things that didn't deal with animals a lot. Well, I've seen it, I have to write this up. And I said, I understand that, but you're ruining your interactions with those PIs. We have to come up with a better method. Coming up with the 3 strikes rule. You see something like that, you make sure you communicate it, and a week later you go back in by yourself as an EHS official and check on it. If they didn't fix it, it's on them. Things like that. And so trying to do that and trying to figure out what can go wrong in the field. I can tell you I've had things go wrong all the way down to being in country and having 15 guys with AK-47s walk up to me and go, what are you doing here? Yeah, I'm seeing faces go, you know, that has happened. And not in countries where I shouldn't have been and where, you know, you would be amazed at how things like that can happen. But it's really nice when you have venomous snakes and you can show them what you're doing. And then they take you to the best places and protect you from any other harm. Places and dealing with things that you don't think about, and that's where I was going. So being tracked by a jaguar in Costa Rica, I have been. I stood up from counting crocodiles. Something moved in the bush. I said, what is that? Started walking back, and you saw these prints right next to my footprints. Okay? Or my little, I think she was 8 when this picture. How many of you actually have ATV training for your grad students? I had one guy out playing on a dune on NASA property and rolled it. Kawasaki mules are the best because they only go 20 miles an hour. And they'll beat your kidneys to death. So those are the ones you need to use because Polaris go 50 miles an hour and young men enjoy that. Flying right here in this picture, that little boat actually hit the rocks and flipped over and I was caught underneath it. The only thing I think that saved my arse was I kayak. And I was able to handle being upside down in the ocean, getting pushed up against the rocks. In Brazil, on Queimada Grande, which is an island full estimation of about 5,000 venomous snakes, 30 kilometers offshore. Okay, so these things should come in. Right here, this picture right here, really important. Happened this summer. These 3 investigators were in Arizona, out during the day. A storm came through. The wash they were in, the investigator, which is the young lady in the middle, Dr. Anna Savage, heard something, said, oh crap, grabbed the other students. They ran up the hill as a wash came right through. And they were stranded overnight in the field with a cougar going and howling. And I'm not kidding. Okay? They did not plan. They did not have a satellite phone. They did not have things that they needed to have.
Okay, back to me. So I'm just going to quickly, because we talked about the JHA or the job hazard analysis, and you have these. I just wanted to reflect. You have this information in your thumb drive. I actually put in an example of one that is, sanitized and removed all the guilty names. But to just give you an idea that you can go through when you get to your thumb drive, that there's an example of what a pretty good JHA looks like that talks about, in that particular instance, the physical types of hazards they might face, including whether temperature, climate, jumping out of planes, falling out of planes, whatever, falling over cliffs. So climate issues, but also biological hazards, whether it's scorpions or venomous animals out there, and any chemical hazard. So I just wanted you don't have to, obviously you can't read that, but just know that it's on your thumb drive. And then we also talked about the, I think I have the waiver here as well. And then there's another one, Chris mentioned a protocol that he used at his other institution. So those are examples for you on your thumb drive. So for the Forest Service, we do have this request for waiver from IACUC oversight. But again, is the information that we capture in there, again, answering certain questions about what you're intending to do, but then giving that sort of box at the bottom to provide that brief description to the IACUC of what you intend to do so that we have that information to review and decide whether you do meet the criteria for a field study and therefore would be exempt. Here's the other part, that page 2 is always important because you can read this later on the thumb drive. What we do say, though, is even if the IACUC grants you that waiver or that exemption now, if anything changes during the course of that study where you do wind up having some type of contact or engagement with animals, that you need to inform the IACUC, you need to come back to the IACUC and allow us to reevaluate that circumstance and whether that changes your waiver or not. So there's a sign-off section here for the principal investigator, okay? So I just want you to know that you have these examples to look at when you get to your thumb drive. Okay, let me go back up here. And so I will find that spot. There we go. So talking about issues in the field, this is an article that I very much digested and made into this one slide for a particular purpose. If you notice, it was published in 2003, but it was this almost 70-year sort of, 1937 to 2000, somebody decided to go back and review these types of job-related mortalities of wildlife workers in the United States. So this author had this published in 2003, and obviously it's a longer article and it goes into some more details, and if you actually add that up, it doesn't come to 100, so I'm cheating. But the big ticket items that are listed here, at the time, over that almost 70-year period, airplane accidents were more than half of the mortality-related events. Drowning was 12%, vehicular accidents, and falls. So those are physical things, right? They fell out of the plane, or the plane crashed, or they drowned, or whatever. So the majority that are presented here are physical hazards. And then I found it interesting that in that article they had plus or minus 3% were animal-related injuries or diseases that those workers contracted. And I thought, 3%? So what does that tell you? Is that true? Is that only 3% out of that 70-year period that they were animal-related injuries, meaning I got bitten by the lion and the tiger, or I've contracted disease? No, what that means is it's underreported. Okay, so I think that there wasn't a recognition or realization of how valuable it is that there are biohazards as well out there as there are physical hazards. Okay, so that's the take-home message. So again, if you're talking about this issue of situational awareness, that's the bottom line. When we go out and do disaster response, planning, and your plan is only as good as what happens when you get there, and you may have to change your plan. But you have to have situational awareness of what you're going to be stepping into. And I can tell you, for all the hazmat technicians and hazmat or hazwapper folks that I've worked with, they will not let Patty the veterinarian go out there and rescue the cow in the field if they see some green glowing gas coming off of that, that area. They are going to yank my collar back and say, I know you want to go rescue that animal, but you're not going out there because that's a hazmat situation. So you have to have that situational awareness. So plan before you act. The idea of working with your safety officers is to identify risks and hazards, physical, chemical, and biological. It may not be the target animal that you're working on, it just is the environment in which you're in. So use practical and systematic approaches to figuring these things out. Again, in veterinary medicine, when we're taught to do physical exams, we're taught to do things consistently, right? From the tip of the nose to the tip of the tail, for example, and you do everything in the same order every time so you don't forget. And the same thing here is you could have a checklist and make sure that when you're going out the door that you checked off all those things that you need to be aware of. Prepare for these different routes of biological or chemical exposure. They can be, in general, either contact. So whether it's, contact on the skin, you might walk into a situation where you didn't know that they were doing herbicide treatment in that area, or they were doing some kind of, pesticide or herbicide spraying overhead, and suddenly you're walking out into that field or that location. So that could be, direct contact. You can obviously have aerosol or inhalation contact, and obviously lots of vectors out there, as we'll talk a lot about ticks. That reminds me, back on one of the earlier slides, in the JHA, there was a picture that actually Chris provided of pulling a tick off the back of that student or that personnel in the field. So here's the caveat for you. If they don't report that they have a tick bite, and this is a true story, there's something called workman's compensation, right? The Occupational Workers' Compensation Plan in many institutions. If you get injured on the job, you often will be covered, right, by your workman's compensation if you fall off the ladder. Well, in one case, they went out to do a field research project, and they didn't report when somebody was bitten by a tick. I think they were kind of cavalier. He didn't come back, and he has, 72 hours to report. He did not bother to report that he had this tick bite. He probably just, pulled off the tick and tossed it away. But within 2 weeks, he developed Lyme disease. And that particular institution would not cover his medical care because he hadn't reported it. Okay, so there are consequences to some of these things. So vectors in particular can be very problematic, Lyme, etc. So implement your risk mitigation measures. There are medical surveillance programs, I know, at many institutions that require you to go through medical clearance. Certainly if you're going to get fit tested for respirators, you have to go through medical clearance before that happens. Also, in order to wear either, physical exams or PPE, right, personal protective equipment, vaccination. We talked earlier, I guess, in the mammal section about rabies prophylaxis, or whether you're going to get tetanus, or whether you're going to have other vaccinations, even influenza vaccine, if you're going to be out working with birds that you might be exposed to. So there's all those things. And training is really, really important. So the big picture is also that we're all connected, right? We're all living on the same little rock that's, right, third rock from the sun, that we're all floating around on the same planet, and we breathe the same air, and in many cases we jump in and share the water with other critters. So I use this as just a really nice sort of Zen moment of the peaceable kingdom, and realizing that we're all part of this wonderful, beautiful world. We don't dominate it necessarily. We have to realize that we share it with others. And we also potentially share their germs too. And that leads us to the epi-triad. So in the traditional epidemiology or veterinary epidemiology as well, we talk about this triad, and it's a dynamic, moving process. You always have some type of a host, whether it's an animal or a person, in that case, another type of animal. You have some type of a pathogen that's out there somewhere that's trying to get at you, and you have the environment. And they're all changing independent in a way of one another. There are different factors that happen with the host. It may be that it's a young host or an older host, a young animal or an older animal. It may be sick for some other reason or debilitated. There are lots of different pathogens, and we talk about just because you find a potential pathogen in an animal, if it is not actually showing signs of disease, is that really a problem? There are a lot of animals that actually are carriers of pathogens, leptospirosis. Opossums and raccoons are natural carriers of leptospirosis. It doesn't bother them to have leptospirobacteria. They may just innocently be shedding it in their urine, but it might bother you if you drink the water from that stream or you're handling those animals. And there's environmental stressors. So animals that are in reproductive mode, in breeding season, in migratory season, those are extra stressors on their physiology that could predispose them to disease. If they're migrating from one point to the next, that, going into different areas. So there's lots of changes that are happening in their world. And we always look at this as either us being outside of this type of triad, and we're talking about an animal and its potential pathogens and its environment, But guess what? We're part of that as well. So when we talk about biosafety in the field, it's not only about making sure that they're safe, that we're not moving infectious agents inadvertently from place to place or field site to field site. We're not creating a new introduction of disease into another naive population, and that to me is an animal welfare issue. It's another reason to loop back and realize why the IACUC and the OC Health and Safety folks are partners, because while they're looking out for your interest, right, and your safety, we're in the IACUC also looking out for the animal's welfare so that you don't become part of this disease transmission process inadvertently because you didn't do proper decon or you didn't use the right PPE and you're moving stuff in the field and you don't even realize it. But you now have introduced a disease into another population and they're going to suffer the consequences. So we're as much as a part of that epitriad as we are looking at it from a distance. And I tell you this one quick story talking about a mortality that was totally preventable. And with all due respect with Tracy, this happened before you were there, but there was an unfortunate incident in the National Park Service with, I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. So let me back up for a second. Yep, we'll go in that direction. So before I get to that story, this is showing actually a little bit as an aftermath of that one fatal story that there were a survey done in the National Park Service. And in this particular case, what they were looking at is what type of PPE or what type of biosafety precautions were being used by the workers out in the field. And they had a whole list of, what are the kind of activities that they do. And so they went down and looked at, how many are handling live animals or sick animals or dead animals, how many are drawing blood, performing necropsies, handling the animals in the darkness. I mean, sort of a laundry list of, what are your actual activities. And then part of that was how many times a year do you do that? So on average, there was, at least somewhere around maybe 40%, 30 to 40% of the time they were doing some of those activities. The next part of that article, and I found this is really insightful, and that's why I wanted to share it with you, and I thank the people who did this survey. This was actually Dave Wong, who is no longer part of that, but Dave Wong is a medical pediatrician in the U.S. Public Health Service. I used to be in the Public Health Service for 3 years as a Commissioned Corps officer in the veterinary category, so I knew Dave, but he also was seconded over to the Park Service at that time. And so anyway, coming back to this, they said, okay, of all those activities, what kind of, basically protection do you use? And you may not see that, I'm sorry, from the distance, but you'll again have the slides on your thumb drive. And they talked about, hand washing, glove usage, vector precautions, other protective measures, and the difference between never using it, like I never use it. The good news is most people, never was probably a pretty minimal situation. And the good news is that most of them, over 50%, did use some type of precaution or precautionary measures or PPE. So the good news is in many cases, over 60% did do something to wash their hands or wear gloves, whatever. But it's not 100%. So that was my take-home message is, I'm really glad that at least 60 or 80% are doing something at some point in time, but there's a few people that are missing. They didn't get the memo. And so when it comes to the risks and hazards in the field, oh, I'm sorry, this is your part. Okay.
So when it comes to risk and hazards in the field, how do we deal with that? Physical-wise, there's a huge amount of risk in the field. And what we have to do is we have to mitigate that risk somehow, some way. So transportation, communication failure, drownings, hypothermia. How many of you require your graduate students and your PIs to have emergency medical training? Wilderness survival. Okay, so at various institutions, that's it. And a lot of times at your EHS group has somebody in that group that's actually a certified trainer of a lot of these aspects. And so trying to mitigate this aspect and trying to go through and work with them to try to deal with the mitigation. Okay. Animals will get back. They will get back at you for being in their area. Okay, no questions asked.
That was just your momentary fun slide, so you can give the animals their due credit. They get even with us occasionally. Thank you. So picking up from the physical, there's a lot of chemical hazards, and for those of you, we talked a little earlier in one of the breakout sessions about chemical mobilization, And some of that had to do with proficiency training as well. So that is really important. You know, there have been substances, some of which are no longer available or soon no longer to be available, like some of the opioids, carfentanil and M99, and, you know, things that'll knock an elephant off its feet and will kill you, you know, with just a little dab will do ya. So we have a lot of really potent chemical immobilization protocols or cocktails that we have used out there, both in veterinary medicine and also in wildlife research. So we have to be cautious of knowing what type of chemicals we're using, knowing if there's reversal agents, knowing how to hit the speed dial help me button if, you know, somebody just went down because they stuck themselves with the needle that had the dart in it, or the dart needle. So, and then there's also just disinfection chemicals. Not all of those are benign. I mean, they're called disinfection chemicals for a reason, and they can go anywhere from just bleach, although bleach splash in your eyes is problematic, but they can get to higher, more caustic chemicals that you have to be careful even as you open up the powder bag and put it into the water that you don't get any aerosolization into your face. And then, as I mentioned before, there's lots of pesticides and agrochemicals that are out there you may not be aware that may have been used nearby or in an area, or just blown down wind from where you're working now that they were using those chemicals upstream, or basically up air. So we just need to be careful about any of those chemical hazards. And then there's a whole slew of biological ones, which of course we won't exhaustively talk about today, but with all due respect to our venomous animal people who are here in the room, there's poisonous plants, and a lot of people don't realize whether they're sensitive to even, you know, poison ivy or any of those types of plants that are out there that you might just put your butt in one day when you sit down to have your lunch. Lots of biotoxins. We talk about algal toxins. There are lots of algal blooms that are happening more often these days, particularly in the summertime. And, you know, you may be working in a water system and you may expose yourself to some of those algal toxins. Lots and lots of vector-borne diseases, and obviously my favorite, zoonotic diseases. We love those. So this is my short A to Z list, and I added Z for Zika recently, as we have come to unfortunately know more about. Puerto Rico alone, even 2 years ago, way before any hurricanes, you know, became more problematic, they had over 5,000 cases of Zika virus in their population. And that is, you know, despite all the precautions or all the spraying that the, you know, government, Puerto Rican government was doing, is a lot of these vector-borne diseases, mosquito-borne, as you well know, are preventable if you use the proper insect repellent. But I do understand that there are times if you're working with amphibians or certain types of animals that are sensitive to those chemicals, you then have to figure out, what does that mean? I have to protect myself, but I also don't want to transfer any of that chemical onto the animals that I'm working with. But you have to be aware of what environment you're in and what are the potential zoonotic disease risks for you in that situation, and then decide how to take proper precautions. So as I was starting to mention before, because I already had this story in mind, again, Dave Wong, he was a great guy that I had a chance to really interact with him on several occasions, and I was so thankful that he was there at that time working with the Park Service from the Public Health Service point of view, because he helped to do the epi investigation. And this was the case of the pneumonic plague, in that young, I say young to just be kind and sympathetic, but this great guy that was a field biologist, right, wildlife biologist, who had a radio collar study going on with his mountain lions. And I guess he got a mortality signal, and forgive me if I'm slightly off on the exact times, but he got a mortality signal typical on a Friday afternoon, right? Everything happens on a Friday afternoon. And he went out, as the story goes, he went out to find where the lion was, and he found the carcass by himself, and then he basically huffed it over his shoulders and carried it down the hill, down the mountain, and he took it home to his garage, where he then, over the weekend, proceeded to do a necropsy. And as the story goes, according to the article, he really wasn't using any PPE. Now, he didn't know at that time why the animal had died, which is why he took it back so that he could do the necropsy, and I don't believe he was wearing gloves or mask or anything. So this lovely gentleman who was trying to follow up on his study on this field investigation, who transported the carcass back and conducted the necropsy, then came down with sort of influenza-like symptoms about 24, 36 hours later. So he had a little febrile, he had a little malaise, he had a little, you know, didn't feel well, and it was, you know, again, in that time of the year, it's November, one could think, oh, maybe I'm coming down with the flu. So he went to one of these, you know, no offense, doc in a box. He went to one of these, you know, walk-in local clinics, and they basically gave him 2 aspirin and said, if you don't feel better in a couple of days, come on back. because it's November, and I'm sure they had a lot of influenza-like illness going on. So they sent him home with some aspirin and, chicken soup. Well, another 24 or so hours later, he was found unconscious by his roommates, who came back and found him laying in the living room, and they rushed him off to the hospital, and he died. And the rest is the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. The rest is that they figured out that the mountain lion that he worked on had died of sylvatic plague, and so had he. And it was unfortunately but totally preventable. Okay, so the good news, though, for Park Service, hats off to the Park Service, is they did a really good response effort internally about training their folks and coming up with public health education materials and field biosafety manuals. And Danielle Butke, who's a colleague at the Park Service and also in the Public Health Service, was really instrumental in helping to get that done. So my credit goes to her. But again, that point is it was totally preventable, and it's unfortunate that young man had to die because of that circumstance. So there are other zoonotic diseases, rabies, which is certainly still out there. We also have a tendency, though, when I am at a lot of public health meetings, is we tend to say, oh, well, the U.S. is canine rabies variant free. And unfortunately for the public, that gets reduced to we're rabies free. And of course, you should know that that's not the case. We're canine rabies virus variant free here in the United States because of the aggressive and very pronounced efforts that we've made over the past 50 years to vaccinate our animals, right? And to prevent the rabies virus from coming from wildlife through our domestic animals to people. But that's not the same with raccoon and skunk and fox and bat variant virus. Those are still out there. So we still have to take precautions.
So how do we mitigate? How do we mitigate for this whole thing? Because it's a lot easier to stick our head in the sand than actually try to deal with it. And so it's very important that we do try to mitigate. And it's communication, medical evaluation. I showed up at Clemson. The first thing, here's your medical surveillance. Please fill out these pieces. Every one of your students fill out these pieces. I will go through them as a medical surveillance officer and work through that. Training, first aid. It's very simple. Most of us have first aid certified trainers on our campuses. If you don't, talk to your department chair, your group leader, and say, look, I want to bring somebody in from the outside to do basic first aid. These are important things. You're trying to mitigate that aspect. ATV, UTV training. I can guarantee you most universities don't have that. Most federal agencies and state agencies do. But I know at UCF we have a marine turtle group that has 15 ATVs. I don't believe historically they had training. Tom Briggs, the new EHS director, came in. He instituted some ATV training, working with them to get that done. Partnered with one of the park services actually to get it done. And so trying to work through it to get that. One of the things that I will implore on every one of you to go back to your home institution, a cheap safety net, are satellite phones. At UCF, Tom Briggs bought 12 satellite phones with 30-minute per month plans. As a PI, I was able to check those out for all my trips. This summer, I had 4 groups in the field. 4 satellite phones were in the field all over the world. Mm-hmm. We had check-in times. Mm-hmm. We could do that. Even the group that was in Arizona that I talked about, they didn't know we got cell phone service. It's not a big deal. We all know that cell phone service is not really good in the West in a lot of places. So it would have been very easy to have that satellite phone that's no cost to you as an investigator, really, to do that. To me, that's a cheap investment into safety. It's a very inexpensive way to do it. Field evacuation plan. And lastly, one of the most important things that doesn't happen at least a lot in academia is an incident follow-up. If something happens, I was taking a tick off Josiah Townsend up in Honduras. Now see, in my classroom, when that happens, it's an automatic quiz. And the person whose cell phone went off doesn't get to take it. Okay? It works really well for peer pressure. Students turn their cell phones off. But these are things that we can do to show that we are consciously trying to mitigate that risk for working in the field. Use of appropriate PPE, insect repellent, personal hygiene. Okay, these are all things. When you're in the field, some of these things aren't really easily to do. I was at 2,000 meters in Honduras this summer. All the water we drank came out of the stream we were camped next to. Okay, setting up simple things like latrines in the field. Don't go upstream to do your business. We set it up over here. Okay, you laugh, but these are things that we have to think about when we're in the field site for 7 or 8 days and you have 10 people. You have to think about these things, okay? Eating and smoking during the field, medical care, keep it with you. Try to have that training. I'm lucky enough that I have some doctor people that really like to play in the field. So I try to talk them into going on some of my trips with me. It's really nice to have an MD who does emergency medicine willing to hike up and play in the field with you. You know, they make a nice living, so that helps too, but we'll go from there.
Happy birthday to you. This is a joke between he and I, so I just wanted to. I told him I was going to start singing Happy Birthday when he was talking about this slide. Happy birthday
Because, no, it's not my birthday, but that's how long you're supposed to wash your hands for.
See?
Sing it twice, I guess.
Yes, I mean,
told
that's
her
the
it
rule
was
of
all
thumb
her.
is you sing Happy Birthday twice while you're washing your hands, and that's supposed to give you enough contact time, right, to get the stuff off your hands. And just a quick note to me, this is my little personal grudge moment. A lot of people have those hand sanitizers. They're great, you know, the alcohol gels, but they don't replace the idea of soap and water. And I know there are times when that's soap and water may not be conveniently available, so you take and you put the gel and you do this and you feel like you're clean. I actually don't feel like I'm clean when I do that, because soap and water is what takes the grime off your hands, and then you go back and use the gel alcohol sanitizer, which then sanitizes your hands, okay? Now, if you have to do it twice, then use the gel first to try to just remove the surface grime and then go back and use the gel a second time. But that's just my little moment to whine. Okay. So other risk mitigation measures, we're going to talk a little bit about PPE. This is obviously not enough time to extensively get you to don and doff and play in your little Tyveks. But the idea, again, is about situational awareness. What level do you need? I always use the example when I was involved with a lot of the high-path AI, avian influenza work over the past decade, and it was hysteria time, and everybody was screaming, you know, Chicken Little, the sky's falling, all going to die. And those of us on the animal side kept saying, yeah, not really. Because I worked on poultry farms in one chapter of my career, and, you know, actually avian influenza was not the big deal that we worried about the day. But, you know, what does it say? And we used to have this kind of funny moment where, you know, let's say veterinarians from, like, you know, the state agriculture or the federal, you know, veterinary services. So the, you know, federal veterinarians would go out onto a farm to do a farm visit in the face of an outbreak, and we might come with, you know, some Tyvek and maybe a little, you know, face mask and some booties and gloves and stuff. We'd show up sort of in what we call like a level C, and then, no offense to anybody here who's public health, but the public health folks would show up in like level A. So they'd be like in the scuba suit, right, with their own oxygen tanks. And so we're walking up in one aisle and they're coming up like, you know, but then the farmer's standing there greeting us and he's in flip-flops and blue jeans. And I'm like, so what does that say to the farmer? Like, which way do I want to go on this? So the idea is for situational awareness is to know, what level do you need? Do you need the level A self-contained breathing apparatus, or do you need a level C? Sometimes all you really need is a change of coveralls. So as long as you're keeping up with the principles, you take coveralls, you go to the field site number 1, and you've got your boots and, you know, rubber boots or whatever, and then maybe you take those coveralls off when you go to a different field site, not working within the same area, but a completely different one, and you put that in a little plastic bag, and you'll come home and launder it later, but you have a clean set to wear for the next time. So just think about what that means. So determining the level of PPE, situational awareness, what kind of diseases or what kind of hazards are you going to find? What are the routes of transmission? Do I need a chem Tyvek that's a more impervious to moisture coming through, or do I actually just need a regular old Tyvek that's sort of level C? Do I need the gloves? Do I need the face mask? I know we talked about real birders don't wear gloves. I'll talk to you later, Ellen. And or sometimes latex gloves are not good with amphibians. So again, you have to kind of work through the situation. Get advice from your OC safety and health folks, but when in doubt, put it on. You're trying to protect yourself. And again, when you're taking it off and your disposable stuff is going in the trash bag to carry out with you, you're going to put a clean set on, so you're again not bringing germs from one place to the next. And record all the people who are using it. Again, that tick bite issue is if somebody's not wearing their proper PPE and they get sick, that may be a problem for their workers' compensation later on because they didn't follow the rules. So again, another moment, what's wrong with this picture? I have no idea who these people are. I just really kind of found this and I thought, I don't even know what they're looking at. But there's something wrong with this picture because that guy is smiling and obviously doesn't have any idea what's going on either. So risk mitigation measures, again, cleaning and disinfection of your tools and equipment. All that decon is real important. Even now with the white nose syndrome, there's a national decon plan that's out there. So any researchers or anybody else who's going into these areas to work with some of the bats, they have specific federal, basically national level decon that they are supposed to abide by when they leave that site. So decon of boots and vehicles, and transport and store your samples properly, and don't be a mechanical vector, okay? Summary. So remember basic situational awareness.
Partner with your EHS. And sometimes EHS doesn't want to partner with you because it's added pieces to that. Keep trying. Keep trying.
And implement your risk mitigation measures. What are the common, injuries or physical hazards that you can that might befall you, no pun intended, when you're out in the field? And a lot of the common zoonotic infections, a lot of these animals, as I said, may carry these pathogens or carry these agents silently and without any harm to them, but they can be a risk to you. And a lot of that is about prevention, right? About vaccination or vector control. Again, happy birthday to you.
Training.
Wash your hands.
Lots of training. And we get inundated. I get emails all the time. So how do you know what training we should ascribe to and what we shouldn't? And that's something to work through within your IACUC and as a partner with your EHS.
Take-home message for everybody, because when we saw the few hands went up before we asked about Ox Safety Now. So promote a culture of prevention among your colleagues or your wildlife professionals for safe work practices in the field. The ounce of prevention motto. Okay, thank you. Right. There's a lot of resources. Again, all of this is on your thumb drive. Lots of different places to go. And also thanks to a lot of folks who actually contributed to this presentation, one that I had done before. Then Chris and I have kind of tweaked it, and I'm glad to have his participation from the venomous animal side. But Daniel Butke, again, I wanted to just shout out to her, Park Service and U.S. Public Health Service, who has been walking some of these issues with her own agency, and I'm taking on that role as well in Forest Service. The one thing I first did when I got to Forest Service, because I have some public health background, is I connected with the Ox Safety and Health officers, in part to basically just say, how can I help you? I'm not here to supersede you or to supplant you, but I'm here to offer my veterinary background to help my Ox Safety and Health folks. Forest Service and Smokey Bear and Incident Command and disaster response and all those things, they're really good at that. But just recently I helped them to revise their Ox Safety and Health manual that they revise every so often. And when they asked me to do this one chapter, they had, 3 zoonotic diseases in there. They had hantavirus, they had Lyme disease, and they had rabies. And I said, that's good. Can I fill in the other parts of the alphabet for you? Remember that other list, that A to Z? Okay, so I just said, here, let me just add some more information that might help those who are reading this manual in the future to use that as a good reference. So thanks to all these people that are listed here and many more.
And we're happy to take questions
Yep.
if we can.
Thank you, guys.
Tim?
Questions?
I just have one specific question that we've been kind of dealing with. What's your feeling regarding vaccine waivers as opposed to the actual vaccine, particularly rabies? We get, students in particular, but we still allow it, but we're kind of thinking that maybe we should not allow it. I'm just wondering what you think about that.
So the question was about vaccine waivers, so that someone doesn't want to have a vaccination for some reason. That's a touchy question and a loaded one because it deals with HIPAA issues. And talking with individuals, perhaps a personal physician, because you don't know what their personal medical history might be, if they have had reactions to vaccines in the past. You know, there are people that are out there that are just hypersensitive and do have vaccine reactions. That's a tough one for me to answer in generality. I can, however, answer it from the herd health protection side of the story, that the whole reason we vaccinate populations of animals, including ourselves, whether it was polio as a kid for us, or measles or mumps and rubella and all the things that I got when I was a kid, was really for herd immunity. Okay, so I'm not suggesting that the individual circumstances don't matter, but part of this issue is that we are protecting a population at large, right, from transmitting diseases from infectious agents from one person to the next. I mean, well, a lot of the reason we get the flu vaccine every year seasonally on the human side is to protect yourself, but you're also protecting yourself from spreading it to other people. So there's herd immunity. Rabies is a little bit different because it is very individual, right? You're either going to get rabies or you're not because you'll be bitten. The other side of the story is also, to make it more complicated, is the health insurance companies. That I will tell you that years ago when I was coming through vet school, you know, when I was at University of Pennsylvania, yay, go VMDs, thank you. I'm telling tales now from my age, but back in the 80s, we didn't have rabies in Pennsylvania. And there was never a reason for any of our veterinary students to get rabies prophylactic vaccine when we were vet students until 1984. Because what was happening was the coon hunters, and apologize to Georgia and Alabama, but there were folks that were driving down to Georgia and Alabama, and they were trapping raccoons, and they were bringing them up to the mid-Atlantic because they wanted more animals to hunt. And they literally, and they had rabies down in Georgia and Alabama already in that wildlife population. They just accelerated the northward migration of that disease, and we had a rabid cow at Penn that year. It was the first ever that we actually had a rabid cow. There were 20 people who put their arm down that cow thinking it was choke, which is, in other words, it had some kind of obstructive, swallowed something. And they had 20 people who had to go out and get post-exposure prophylactic rabies vaccination after the one large animal vet who was a graduate from Georgia said, I think it's rabies. Anyway, so thereafter, we all got pre-exposure, and many people in high-risk situations, animal control officers, all were allowed through their health insurance to go get pre-exposure vaccination if you were in a high-risk situation. Not so much anymore. The insurance companies are playing Russian roulette right now, and I apologize for a political soundbite, but they'd rather look at giving you post-exposure treatment after you were bitten, whether the animal was tested or not, then pay the preventive medicine care costs up front. So that's part of this bigger issue.
Ellen?
Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, feral cats are now turning up with rabies, and feral cats are everywhere. So when you're out in the field and you're concerned about what might be out there that you might encounter, be careful about feral cats. And because so many people, well-meaning people, are feeding feral cats, they are not afraid of humans, and in fact may actively seek you out hoping that you have food. So be really aware of feral cats. But what I really came here to say is everything you said is 100% true, but it has to be tempered by common sense. And this is the one thing that I think both of you left out, which is what is the potential exposure for any of these things? Some of them are extremely low frequency, and some are reportable to CDC or to the states, and you can see, and I've obviously only looked at bird-related zoonoses such as chlamydiosis and salmonellosis. Oh God, I hate that word, salmonellosis. The rates are extremely low, and if treated promptly, are easily cured. But they could be very serious, especially salmonellosis, if it's not treated promptly. Number of researchers nailed by West Nile, one from a needle stick in a lab, and this was during the height of the West Nile spread on the East Coast. HPAI, well, at first, before we actually knew about how the H5N1 strain was contracted and how difficult it is for humans to contract it because of the method of transmission, I would have worn a moon suit initially, but as we learned how it was transmitted and how difficult it is for humans to contract, I would have dialed it back. So it depends on what stage you are in terms of your knowledge about the manner of transmission, the risk of exposure, the potential harm to be done. If I was concerned about West Nile, I'd say, I don't care. I'm no longer young, but I'm not immunocompromised. So I'm not going to really worry about this too much. This is not a big one for me. And that was the kind of calculus I would make before I would start suiting up or even wearing gloves. If it was something like HPAI and it was a new strain, I'd be far more cautious until I had some pretty good knowledge about the rate of transmission, the manner of transmission, and so on. And so every single one of these things, whether it's zoonotic or anything else, to me has to be tempered by how big a risk, how severe is the exposure or frequency. I'd be far more concerned about plane accidents and hunting accidents. Almost every state, you can hunt at least 6 days of the week. In my state, Maryland, which is a heavily populated, not rural state, there's a hunting season for something almost all year long. Part of what the state permits do is they look at potential user conflicts. Where are you going to be and when are you going to be there, so they can try to prevent user conflicts, the big one being hunting. And of all of the researchers that I've heard of who have died during the time I've been in this particular field, 2 of them have been hunting, 1 has been Hanta, 8 have been plane accidents. None have been, that I can think of, have been other zoonotics. And then finally, I wanted to point out that you all missed one huge category of risk in the field, and that is other humans. I very rarely worry about snakes or bears or raccoons or any of that, but I worry like heck about other humans. And I don't honestly know what to say about that in terms of protecting yourself. I personally wouldn't want to carry a sidearm, although I'm not a bad shot. And so I don't know how to protect myself against other humans in the field, but I think that is one of the biggest risks we face.
Thank you. And that's all comes down to situational awareness. That's
Yep.
the bottom line.
I'll be quick. I'll put on my select agent hat and add to the occupational health that it's really important to have an open dialogue about near misses, because that may prevent an accident, a full miss or a full attack. But in our culture, we're really afraid of saying that we made a mistake or that we had a near miss ourselves. But that is when I go to my annual biosafety training, that's what I get the most out of that particular session, is the review of what near misses have happened and what attacks have happened during that last year. So as many of you are IACUC and biosafety, those are the kind of things you can take back to your agency.
That's huge. Trying to set the relationship up, and I do this with my graduate students. It's okay to tell me you almost had, or you had these sorts of things, because we can try to mitigate that. And that's a majorly excellent point, because we have to have the relationship that it's not going to be, oh, you told me, now I'm going to get you in trouble. We have to have that good communication. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.